psychological horror. This is what Visage is all about. Let me start this one off by saying this game is, by design, intended to be hard. The game straight up tells you this before you even start, so you're probably thinking, okay, some difficult enemies or moments, but probably nothing I can't handle. And boy would you be wrong. It's not even what I just mentioned that's hard, but rather the game itself. I mean, literally. The controls and how some systems are handled purely make the games, at times, unenjoyable. Now, before I get into things, I do want to put out a slight disclaimer that I may not be the target audience for this game, but I do enjoy horror games a lot, and so because of that, I wanted to play this game. So just keep that in mind with how I talk about some things. Let's start this one off by talking about the game's length. It is a long game. It took me around 12 hours to complete from start to finish. That's with me having to look up some guides for some parts of the game because I just couldn't figure it out. What helps a little is this game being broken up into 4 chapters, followed by the finale. And the finale has 2 endings, but let's reel it back and talk about the chapters a bit, because I thought 2 of them were actually quite good for the most part, while one of them, well, let's just say I couldn't wait for it to be over. Not because it was scary or anything, because if I'm honest, it wasn't even really scary, but I'll get to that one in due time. One thing I do want to make clear before I get into any of the chapters is you can do them in any order. Once you start one though, you are locked into it until you finish it. One thing I should mention before I get started is this game is the type of game where you have to figure everything out on your own. You also have to manage your resources, which you wouldn't really think is an issue until you realize you can only store 5 items in your inventory. Most of which I personally dedicated to pills for sanity, but never really popped any pills because I kept sticking to the light as much as possible. Though there are some parts of the game where having your own light source is crucial. This game does run you through the important aspects of the game to at least tell you the key systems and mechanics, and it gives you the controls to actually play the game, but after that, everything's now on you. You have one place where key items will be stored if you move too far away from them after dropping them. And by too far, I mean like you walk 30 feet away from the item and poof, back to storage. So you can't really bring them with you and then drop them in convenient spots. With lighting being so crucial in this game, I found myself constantly looking for a lighter for when I'm in the pitch black darkness, though they have a very limited lifespan and end up being rendered useless when I'm most needing them. Another thing is that I'd frequently be fighting the controls themselves to actually play the game. This game has 2 movement speeds, walking and running. Well, I wouldn't even call it running. I'd say more of speed walking, since it barely lets you move faster than walking. So when people say this game is a walking simulator, that's why. I'd run into an enemy, start to move backwards, then try to sprint backwards, but instead do a 180, which I wasn't trying to do. It honestly should have required a 3rd button press to 180, but I won't get into that. Some of the items you pick up in the game also require you to use 2 hands, and if you have, say, a lighter or a light bulb in one hand, but the sledgehammer in another, you'd probably think, okay, no problem, I'll just place the bulb in my inventory, which would be logical. Except for this game doesn't think to do that, and instead tells you that you can't store that. So in order to actually store said item, I'd have to drop the sledgehammer or the crowbar, whichever 2-handed item I possessed, and drop it to the ground. Place the 1-handed item in my inventory, and then pick up the 2-handed item back up off the ground. So unnecessary and pointless. But I'm not going to sit here and dunk on the controls too much because they could be perfectly reasonable for this type of game, but for someone like me, it just didn't make sense. Lastly, before I dive into the chapters themselves, let's quickly cover the story itself. You're playing as Dwayne Anderson, and you've just killed your family, plus yourself, with a revolver because you have problems. The game starts with this intense cutscene of you doing just that, and once it finishes, it puts you directly into the house with literally no direction of what to do. It's basically inspired by PT, the demo that got released and then taken off the PlayStation Store. When I said earlier this game is the you're on your own type, I mean it. But basically, you're going through and experiencing the stories of the past residents of this house. After you finish the 3 past residents, you deal with your own problems with some mini-stories of Dwayne. Then, you head into the finale. So, let's get into it. Let's start with Lucy's chapter. This was, in my opinion, probably the second best chapter. I will admit, this one had me feeling like they took direct inspiration from The Ring, which is a great movie, and as you can tell by the title of this chapter, you'll be learning about Lucy's story, which is quite grim, but it makes for some nice horror elements. I'll try not to spoil anything story related in case you haven't played this game yet and decide you want to after this review, but basically, Lucy appears to be a bit of a troubled young girl and her parents can't really figure out what to do. There are some puzzles you have to solve which aren't the most confusing, and for the most part I figured things out for myself. As I mentioned before, this game doesn't tell you what to do outside of the basics for how to play, but it will give you hints. For example, you need the Cage's room key to get past the first area, and if you try to interact with the obvious door, you'll get a message that tells you you need the key. But then it's up to you to figure out where it could be. So, you may spend 10 minutes just trying to get around in the darkness while avoiding Lucy, all while trying to get the first key, just to get past that part of the chapter. Granted, they have nightstands with 2 drawers which may contain the key, but in reality it's just a lot of flashing your camera every few seconds to see and find a nightstand. All, again, while avoiding Lucy. This chapter is heavily into the narrative of Lucy and telling you about her, the friend she makes, and how things just went south. I will say the gameplay is good at the beginning with the various areas and learning about Lucy, but then when you get near the end, it just falls apart a bit because you're pretty much forced to use your camera flash to navigate through dark and narrow hallways. At the end of the chapter, you are rewarded with the conclusion of her chapter, which explains what happened to her and why, which is pretty gruesome. It also basically sets a tone for this game because there's a common theme with all the chapters. If you don't pay attention to the story, you may not understand the correlation. It is really a game that requires your full attention. Overall, probably my second favorite chapter. Next, let's talk about Racken's chapter. This one to me was just not enjoyable. Racken himself wasn't even really scary, and the hospital was convoluted. Granted, if I looked at it from a top down, I'd probably understand things, but I like to explore, so I went into pretty much every room I could. It also introduces something new to you and doesn't tell you, which is having to physically rub against an object to push it. Oh, and this is only used in this chapter, so don't get used to being able to push things after the 2 objects. I was stuck in the first room where you push something for 10 minutes before I realized I could move the damn table by rubbing up against it. This was not presented to me at any point beforehand, so how do you expect me to realize this? This chapter also presents you with a new enemy, but doesn't explain anything about them to you. They take the Souls game style approach of fuck around and find out, which means you'll probably die in order to realize what you are actually supposed to do. They also look like if Voldemort had kids. Now, I'll give the devs props for actually creating a new location beyond the house, as it keeps things from getting stale. The unfortunate thing for me with this is, at least on the PC version, when you die, there's like a 25% chance your game will crash on the loading screen.
Ain't that swell?
Anyways, this chapter is about learning who Racken is, and why he's placed in a psychiatric facility. He's presented as this tall but skinny guy who requires crutches to walk, so you'd think he can only move so fast. Yet he moves faster than some of the other enemies in this game, which is crazy. I honestly could not wait to get through this chapter, and it got to the point where I just said, nah, I'm good. I'll just use a guide to speed through this. I truly did not have any interest in this chapter, which sucks because being in a hospital rather than the house was a bit of a breath of fresh air. Regardless, it wasn't really scary, and the gameplay really didn't interest me. But the hospital was nicely designed for the most part, at least. Since I'd primarily just be criticizing the Racken chapter, I'll just say that it overall has some neat moments of scares and has a few nice areas in the environments, but overall, it was a chapter that I just really did not care for. It also felt a little drawn out, a little longer than it should have been, but maybe that's just me. The last true chapter, though, is the Dolores chapter. Honestly, this was my personal favorite. It used the house itself, and it did a great job of utilizing the already relatively small space, which is also essentially the central hub, and makes gameplay out of it. Not to mention, it managed to connect various sections of the house that are originally fairly far apart via useful shortcuts. Now, this chapter starts with finding mirrors, and ends up having you discover secrets hidden in the home. It takes you through various spaces, and uses cassette tapes to tell you about Dolores, who suffered from schizophrenia, and her husband is unsure of what to do, but is terrified, because she had mistaken a doll for her own baby. When she realized it was just a doll, she threw it away, which made the husband worried because he thought she'd eventually do that to the baby. As you continue, you get more of the story through the mirrors, and eventually have to help her get her baby back. The way the developers created all of this through the house was awesome, and kept me invested, and the ending of this chapter just had me like, God damn, that's fucked up, which is exactly what you'd expect from this sort of game. It was just well done, and since it wasn't very reliant on resource management or fighting the controls to only hold what you intend, it was the most enjoyable to me. Now, let's talk about the final chapter, which I don't think has a name. You just collect pieces of a mask. I'll be honest, this one was somewhat fun, but holy hell was it just sad. This chapter goes over who you play as, Dwayne Anderson, and his many problems he had which affected his family directly. The game has you doing various short tasks related to each of his problems, which you can only do once you've completed specific chapters. For example, you must complete the Lucy chapter to be able to receive one of the tapes. So you have to complete all 3 chapters to be able to complete all the tapes, or collect all the tapes. This is a chapter where resource management really comes into play, and since I mostly held onto the pills and only had one space for things that weren't pills, it felt like I really fucked myself over. I will also say, the game felt dragged out at this point, and I was honestly just ready to finish the game. Now, some of the tapes were really just not fun, such as when you have to go into the basement and knock down the walls. The gameplay in concept is sort of interesting, and you definitely feel scared, but it again was a part of the game where the controls feel like they're working against you, which just makes the game hard, but in a way where it doesn't feel like you can learn how to improve anything other than hoping the game doesn't try to screw you over. However, there were some tapes that were actually kind of fun, like when you go into the underworld and travel by boat to a lighthouse, though that cutscene was, well, all I can say is,
alrighty then.
Some tapes had a shorter puzzle to solve, others were a bit longer, but once you finish all the tapes, you get 2 possible endings. I got an ending where I got to see Dwayne's family, which, after all the tapes, was some nice closure, I suppose. Overall, portions of this game seemed very drawn out, and while they had enjoyable moments, they also went on for too long. Felt like the Fast and the Furious movies. They have several good ones, but at one point it's just like, alright guy, enough's enough, stop this. While there were some enjoyable moments and fun segments that gave me the horror I was looking for, the overall game just did not keep me engaged or interested in the overall game. Between the controls, drawn out sections, bugs and crashes that I encountered, and some unique AI, I just lost more and more interest as the game went on. While some of the scares were well done and worked well with how they designed the game, I just don't think I can recommend this game to anyone who doesn't have the time or the energy to invest 10 plus hours to finish this game. What I mean by that is, if you're a casual gamer who wants to spend a few hours per day after work sitting on the couch and having some food or something before bed, this may not be the game for you. This feels like a game where if you aren't fully paying attention or you have constant distractions around you and you're constantly getting up, you'll likely quit early on. This definitely feels like a hardcore game for players who are able to invest the time, the energy, and have the patience to enjoy a slow burn style game. Though, in fairness, the game does warn you about this at the start. I wanted to like this game, and I wanted it to be good, but unfortunately, I'm giving it a 5 graves out of 10. I'd say if you want to get the scares from this game, but you don't want to dedicate the time, check out a long play channel that has no commentary and then just full screen it to immerse yourself in it. Anyways, this is my review for Visage. If you have a recommendation for a horror game I should review, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.